Welcome to Chronicles of Old Tales. Today, we journey back to a time of both unparalleled luxury and unimaginable brutality. Our story begins with a teenage princess, the Archduchess Marie Antoinette of Austria, leaving her home in a procession of golden carriages, a living symbol of a new alliance destined to make her the Queen of France. She was just 14, a bright-eyed girl stepping into a fairy tale. That fairy tale would curdle into a nightmare. She would leave this world not in a golden carriage, but in a common wooden cart, her hands bound tightly behind her back, her once famous blonde hair crudely hacked off for the executioner's blade. They didn't need racks, wheels, or iron maidens to torture Marie Antoinette. Her torment was a far more insidious affair, a masterpiece of psychological cruelty designed to break her mind, her heart, and her spirit. This is the story of how an entire nation, in the throes of a violent rebirth, systematically broke its queen, long before the cold steel of the guillotine ever fell. Before the blood, the blade, and the baying mobs, there was Versailles, a universe of shimmering gold leaf, endless mirrored halls, and suffocating, soul-crushing rules. Imagine you are a 14-year-old girl, plucked from the relative informality of the Austrian court and dropped into the most lavish, most scrutinized, and most rigidly structured court in the entire world. This was Marie Antoinette's new reality in 1770. She wasn't a Machiavellian political strategist or a seasoned diplomat. She was a teenager, married by proxy to a boy she had never met, the future Louis XVI, to seal a political alliance between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons that many in France deeply resented. She was handed a crown and expected to perform a role she had not been prepared for and never truly understood. Her life was not her own. It was a public spectacle from the moment she awoke to the moment she slept. Her rising ceremony, the lever, and her retiring ceremony, the coucher, were not private moments of rest but elaborate, public rituals attended by a legion of courtiers. Every action was governed by a complex and often bizarre etiquette. Who could sit on a stool versus a chair with arms, the precise way one had to scratch upon a door instead of knocking, the elaborate dance of precedence. It was a theater of power, and she was its unwilling star. Dozens of eyes watched her get dressed, judged the way she ate her meals in the public dining ceremony known as the Grand Couvert, and whispered about her every glance and gesture. Her primary, and for many, her singular purpose, was to produce a male heir for the throne of France. But the marriage between a shy, awkward 15-year-old groom and a naive 14-year-old bride went unconsummated for 7 agonizing years. The whispers began almost immediately. Was the king impotent? Was the foreign queen barren? Vicious, pornographic pamphlets, the 18th century version of viral social media, began to circulate through the streets of Paris. These libelous painted her as a promiscuous, foreign temptress, a monster of depravity draining the nation's wealth for her own deviant amusements. The reasons for the marital delay were complex. Louis was thought by some to suffer from a painful medical condition called phimosis, while others point to the couple's profound youth, inexperience, and the immense psychological pressure they were under. Regardless of the cause, the result was a public relations disaster that branded Marie Antoinette with a stain of failure and foreign corruption before she had even truly begun her reign. When she finally did begin to have children, the damage was already done. She sought escape from the oppressive scrutiny of the court, creating her own private world. She threw lavish parties, gambled, and indulged in the towering, elaborate hairstyles that became her trademark. More famously, Louis XVI gifted her the Petit Trianon, a small chateau on the grounds of Versailles. There, she could shed the stiff formality and crushing etiquette of the main palace. She expanded the estate to include a rustic hamlet, the Hameau de la Reine, complete with a farmhouse, a dairy, and a mill, a fantasy of pastoral simplicity. To her, it was a necessary refuge, a place to breathe. To her critics, it was the ultimate symbol of her detachment and frivolous waste. They saw a queen playing dress-up as a milkmaid while real milkmaids starved. The perception of her as a reckless spender crystallized into a single, devastating nickname: Madame Déficit. This cruel brand was a gross oversimplification. France's financial problems were the result of generations of fiscal mismanagement, expensive wars, including support for the American Revolution, and a tax system that exempted the wealthiest classes, the nobility and the clergy from bearing their fair share. But it was easier to blame the foreign queen. The narrative was simple and powerful. The nation was bankrupt because of her silks, her diamonds, and her parties. This image was cemented in the public mind by the infamous affair of the diamond necklace in 1785. In a complex con, a trickster named the Comtesse de la Motte duped the Cardinal de Rohan into acquiring an obscenely expensive diamond necklace, convincing him it was secretly for the queen. Marie Antoinette was entirely innocent. She had previously rejected buying the necklace. Yet when the scandal broke, the public readily believed she was the villain. Her acquittal in the subsequent trial did nothing to clear her name. In the court of public opinion, she was guilty, and her reputation was irrevocably destroyed. While she tried to find an escape in the manufactured simplicity of her private hamlet, the world outside the palace gates was quite literally starving. The price of bread, the staple food for the vast majority of the population, was skyrocketing due to poor harvests and a deregulated grain market. A common worker could spend up to 88% of his daily wages on a single loaf of bread. The gap between the gilded cage of Versailles and the gritty, desperate reality of Paris was growing wider and deeper. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread for the few and the stench of bitter resentment from the many. Every rustle of silk in the palace seemed to echo the grumbling of empty stomachs in the city. It was in this climate that the apocryphal and infamous phrase, "Let them eat cake," was attributed to her. There is no credible evidence she ever said it. The phrase, or a version of it, appeared in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau when she was just a child. But it didn't matter. It perfectly captured the image of the heartless, out-of-touch queen that her enemies had so successfully crafted. She was, blissfully, tragically unaware that she was dancing on the edge of a volcano, and the ground beneath her feet was starting to tremble. The opulence that had defined her life was slowly, inexorably, becoming the evidence that would be used to condemn her. The turning point wasn't a single event, but a roar that rose from the hungry streets of Paris. On October 5, 1789, thousands of Parisian women, furious over the crippling price of bread, began to march. They first took over the city hall, seizing weapons and provisions, and then, encouraged by revolutionaries, set their sights on the ultimate source of their misery, the king and queen at Versailles, 12 miles away. Armed with pitchforks, pikes, and fury, their numbers swelled to thousands. This was a force the palace guards could not contain. They breached the palace gates, screaming for the queen, their rage specifically directed at the Austrian. They flooded the courtyards and swarmed up the staircases, killing guards and storming toward the queen's private apartments. Marie Antoinette barely escaped with her life, fleeing through a secret passage to the king's chambers just moments before the mob hacked her bed to pieces. This was the moment the illusion of absolute monarchy shattered. The royal family was forced to appear on a balcony to a hostile crowd that now dictated their fate. They were compelled to leave Versailles and move to the Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris, trading their golden cage for what would become a prison of the people's making. They were no longer absolute monarchs. They were hostages of the revolution. The next few years were a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion. Life in the Tuileries was a tense existence under constant surveillance. The king, indecisive and overwhelmed, tried to work within the new framework of a constitutional monarchy, but trust was broken on both sides. In June 1791, the family undertook a disastrous escape attempt, hoping to reach the royalist stronghold of Montmedy on the eastern frontier. Disguised as servants, they fled Paris in a large, conspicuous carriage, but a series of delays and mistakes doomed the plan. The king was recognized in the town of Saint Menehould, and they were stopped and arrested in Varennes, just short of their goal. Their capture and humiliating return to a silent, hostile Paris cemented their image as traitors in the public mind. The flight to Varennes destroyed any remaining credibility the king had and fueled the rise of republicanism. The final blow to the monarchy came on August 10, 1792. Amidst fears of foreign invasion by Austria and Prussia to restore the king's power, an armed mob of revolutionaries and National Guardsmen stormed the Tuileries Palace. A brutal battle ensued, resulting in the massacre of hundreds of the king's loyal Swiss guards. The royal family fled and took refuge with the Legislative Assembly, but it was too late. The monarchy was formally suspended. They were stripped of their titles and imprisoned in the grim, medieval temple fortress. No longer King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, they were simply Louis and Antoinette Capet, citizens in a republic that despised them. The systematic dismantling of her soul now began in earnest. First, they took her husband. In December 1792, citizen Louis Capet was put on trial for high treason. Convicted by the National Convention, he was condemned to death. On January 21, 1793, he was executed by the guillotine. From her tower window in the temple, Marie Antoinette heard the cannons fire, the prearranged signal that she was now a widow and her children were fatherless. But the revolutionaries understood that the deepest way to torture a mother is through her children. They reserved a special cruelty for her. On the night of July 3, 1793, officials burst into her cell and ripped her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, from her arms. Her screams and pleas were ignored. He was her beloved son, and to royalists, he was now King Louis XVII. The revolutionaries were determined to break him, both physically and symbolically. He was put in the care of a coarse cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was instructed to re-educate the boy. He was kept in a cell just below hers, where she could often hear his cries. He was intentionally brutalized, taught to drink, sing revolutionary songs, and curse his own parents. This was a torment more profound than any physical device could ever inflict. The constant, gnawing agony of a mother, helpless, listening to the systematic psychological and spiritual destruction of her own child, just one floor away. On the night of August 1, 1793, she was taken from the temple, leaving her daughter and sister-in-law behind. Her final stop was the conciergerie, a place known by another, more chilling name, the antechamber to the guillotine. This wasn't a prison for holding people long-term. It was a warehouse for the condemned, the final, grim processing center before the scaffold. Her cell was small, damp, and dark, reeking of misery. The only barrier between her and the outside world was a thin screen, behind which 2 guards watched her every move, day and night. There was no privacy, no dignity, and no escape from their constant, leering gaze. For a woman raised as a queen, whose very body had been a public institution, this final, crude violation was a profound humiliation. Her health, already fragile from stress and grief, completely collapsed. She suffered from constant, severe hemorrhaging, likely uterine cancer, but her pleas for medical care or even basic privacy were largely ignored. The stress, malnourishment, and illness caused her to waste away. At just 37 years old, her once famous and luxuriantly coiffed blonde hair had turned completely white. She was a ghost of the queen she had been, a woman being systematically erased from existence even before her official death sentence was passed. Then came the trial, which began on October 14, 1793. It was a sham, a piece of political theater designed for one purpose: to legally murder the last queen of France. The outcome had been decided in advance by the Committee of Public Safety. The proceedings lasted less than 2 days. She was accused of everything imaginable, of bankrupting the nation with her spending, of orchestrating orgies at Versailles, and of conspiring with foreign powers, especially her native Austria, against the Republic. She faced it all with a stoic, almost unnerving calm, defending herself with intelligence and composure against the barrage of lies. But her accusers, led by the radical journalist Jacques Hébert, had saved their most venomous and monstrous charge for last. They brought in her own son, the little Louis Charles, who had been brutalized and coerced under duress by his captors. They claimed the boy had confessed to acts of incest with his mother. It was a grotesque lie, a charge so vile it was designed to utterly destroy what was left of her character and her humanity. For the first time during the trial, Marie Antoinette's composure broke. She didn't shout or weep. Instead, when pressed for a response to the horrific allegation, she rose to her feet, turned away from her judges, and appealed directly to the women packed into the courtroom. "I appeal to all mothers present in this room," she said, her voice ringing with pure pain. Has such a charge even been heard of? A wave of sympathy, a brief, palpable shudder of shared humanity, rippled through the crowd. Even the revolutionary women who had hated her felt the power of her cry. But it wasn't enough. The verdict was never in doubt. Guilty of high treason. The sentence was death. Returned to her cell at the conciergerie, She knew she only had hours left. She asked for a pen, paper, and a light. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 16, 1793, she wrote a final, heartbreaking letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. "It is to you, my sister, that I write for the last time," she began. "I have just been condemned, not to a shameful death, for such is only for criminals, but to go and rejoin your brother." In a testament to her profound strength of character, she forgave her enemies and, most poignantly, begged her children not to seek revenge for their deaths. "Let my son never forget the last words of his father, which I repeat emphatically," she wrote. "Let him never seek to avenge our deaths." It was her last act of defiance, her true testament. The letter was intercepted by her jailers and never delivered to her sister-in-law. On the morning of October 16th, the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, entered her cell. He crudely cut her white hair, the shorn locks falling to the floor, and bound her hands tightly behind her back. She had expected a closed carriage, the small mercy that her husband had been granted for his own journey to the scaffold. Instead, she was led out to a tumbril, an open wooden cart used for common criminals, designed for maximum public shaming. The ride through Paris was the final, calculated humiliation. For over an hour, she was paraded through streets packed with a jeering, screaming mob. They hurled insults, spat, and celebrated her impending death. The famous revolutionary artist Jacques-Louis David, watching from a window, captured the moment in a harsh, unflinching sketch. It shows a woman, aged beyond her years, her face gaunt, her jaw set, wearing a simple cap and dress, her back held rigidly straight. Through all the hatred and vitriol, she remained composed, her gaze fixed ahead. She refused to give the mob the satisfaction of seeing her break. At the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, she climbed the wooden steps of the scaffold. Her world was now just a sea of hostile faces and the towering, grim silhouette of the guillotine. In her final moments, moving toward the plank, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. She turned to him and uttered her last words, not a grand political statement, but a quiet testament to the person she was beneath the crown, a final, instinctive act of courtesy. "Pardon me, monsieur. I did not do it on purpose." A moment later, it was over. The blade fell. Sanson's son, Henri, who performed the execution, held her head aloft, and the crowd roared in a final, savage cheer. Marie Antoinette wasn't tortured with racks or hot irons in a dungeon. Her torture was a slow, methodical, and public destruction of the human spirit. It was the torment of a life lived under a microscope, of being blamed for a nation's deep-seated ills. It was the agony of being stripped of her husband, her children, her reputation, her dignity, and finally, her life. They took everything from her, but in the end, they could not take her final, quiet act of composure. If you found this story from history's darker chapters compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more from Chronicles of Old Tales. We want to hear from you in the comments. What does the tragic fall of Marie Antoinette mean to you? Thank you for watching.